Welcome, everyone. I hope you can hear me in the back of the room. If you ever cannot hear me, please make a fuss about it, and I will try to be a little bit louder. I tend to be a quiet person. I'm the only cheerleader that got demerits for not yelling loud enough, so it's just me. So if you have not yet, please sign up for a developer org. You may have one before coming to Dreamforce. We would prefer that you not use it because there could be something that you've already done in that developer org that causes some conflicts with the workbook activities that we're going to give you today. So the sign-up link is there on the screen. If you have not yet signed up for a brand new developer org, there's your link. Please go ahead and do that. And just to make sure you're in the right room, this is Apex for Admins, Introduction to Coding for Admins and Non-Coders. All of you in the room, could you raise your hand, please, if you are currently a Salesforce admin? Woohoo! Wow, that is and any of you follow Mike Gerholt's Clicks Not Code? Woo, that's a pretty good group. So you know that Mike has said whenever you hear the word admins, you're supposed to cheer really loudly. So we're going to try that again. This is Apex for Admins. Thank you. How many of you are admins? Woohoo! Excellent. Thank you. So I started out where you did. But first, I'm going to start out on the safe harbor. Sorry, I don't work for Salesforce. So any decisions that you make about purchasing Salesforce products or Salesforce stock, please make them based on your own research and make them based on the current state of the product and services. My name is Bonnie Hinners, and I'm a Salesforce architect. I've been working with Salesforce companies that use Salesforce for about 10 years, and I have a few certifications, but I don't yet have advanced developer. It's still on my roadmap. I'm hoping that I will get that. But I wanted you to see that I'm actually approaching this from the same direction that you all are approaching it. I'm coming at this from the admin perspective. I've done a lot of things that admins do and not as much of what developers do. I'm going to switch back 2 slides. I'm on Twitter, so if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or just want to follow me, you can find me at SnugSFBay. That actually at one point stood for Salesforce Nonprofit User Group, San Francisco Bay Area, believe it or not. I run the Salesforce Nonprofit User Group here in the Bay Area. So, how many of you in the room consider yourself currently to be coders? Any coders in the room? We got a couple. Actually, those 2 are coders, and you're a coder, and you're a coder. You are all coders, and you just don't know it yet. I actually in college studied computer science. I also studied English. Those were my 2 majors. And the best coding advice I got in my English classes, my English composition class. And that advice was read more. So read code. Read books about code, read all of the online help about writing code, and read the code. Read other people's code. It will make you a better writer. The other great advice I got about becoming a coder from my English composition class is write more. Write all the time. Write things just because you want to see if you can make it work. Don't wait for a project that you have to solve. Try to write something every day. See, just keep your skills in practice there and keep practicing something new and different. So again, I'm kind of approaching this from a different point of view, and that is if you know English or any human language, you are actually a coder. When we speak English or any other human language, we are encoding information and passing that information to other people to decode from us. We are all coders. And, Shakespeare was a great coder. Look at the kind of stuff he put together. Or I think it's Basho, who is the famous haiku writer. These guys are all coders. They follow very specific rules, and they are expecting a certain outcome from what they've written. And that's what we all do in all of our coding exercises, whether that coding is dealing with a computer or whether that coding is dealing with each other in coding that we do. The other thing I want you to know about coding that you may not know This flow here on the side has been passed around the internet for a while now. It is called What a Programmer Does All Day. And I hope you can read it in the back. It says ARG, and then the next part of the flow is ARG. There are two choices off of the second ARG. Either it's ARG or it's ARG. Basically, it loops around forever in ARGs. So when you find yourself coding and you think it's going to work and it doesn't, and you go ARG, know that everyone does that. Know that even the programmers who went to school and have been doing it every day for 10 years, they're still doing ARGs. And if you're not doing ARGs, you're not trying hard enough. You're not challenging yourself. You're not doing new things. You're just doing the same old thing all the time. Doing the same old thing is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you really want to, keep your skills growing, then you're going to experience all those ARG moments. Don't let it discourage you. Today we're going to go through why you should be doing clicks, not code, because we're not trying to convince you to change your ways. You have a lot of skills in the clicks area, and that's a huge area of what it means to be a Salesforce developer. In fact, the very first developer certification that you get is really quite oriented towards that clicks, not code type of development. So the other thing we're going to look at is Visualforce and Apex, talk about how they're different, how you can use them in your org to expand what you're able to do and what your users are able to do. We're going to talk about SOQL, which is the Salesforce Object Query Language. We're going to talk about triggers. Anybody in here especially interested in learning to write triggers? That's a big part of why people start getting into coding from admin, I think. And Apex test classes and why they're important. Again, one more reminder, if you haven't got your developer org yet, it's developers.salesforce.com/signup. And we will have a workshop at the bit.ly address, workbook that we'll be going through. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is two approaches to development. We've got the declarative approach and the programmatic approach. You guys know the declarative approach. You're all admins. You're all doing that when you create an object in Salesforce. You're being a developer. You're developing a new part of a data model. When you create a new field in Salesforce, you're being a developer and you're creating a new portion of the data model. That is actually a huge deal. We're lucky that Salesforce makes it so easy for us, and it's one of the reasons that this ecosystem in this environment is so friendly for people to move from that admin role to more of a developer role and bounce back and forth. With formula fields and validation rules and workflows and approvals, you're doing more of the business logic. So that's a little bit beyond the data model. That's what we call the controller. So you're actually manipulating data in a way you're controlling what that data does, and you're doing it behind the scenes. So you're already being a developer when you write formulas. You're doing that control portion of the development effort. And the last development effort, you see I'm starting from the bottom and working up. The last development effort that you're already quite familiar with is page layouts and record types. You're controlling that user's view. View is the third portion of what a developer works with. You're controlling that view whenever you edit page layouts. So again, you're already a developer because you do page layouts, formula fields, custom objects, custom fields. And those are the model, view, and controller portions of the development effort that you will see over and over again and here referred to over and over again. From the programmatic approach, Visualforce pages and Visualforce components give you the ability to customize that UI to a greater extent. You can do more branding, you can remove sidebars and headers and just make the page look like your web page, for example. You can serve up Visualforce pages on your website, actually, using publicforce.com site pages. So there are reasons that you would go beyond the page layout and use Visualforce. From the business logic point of view, the controller point of view, Apex controllers are used in conjunction with Visualforce pages to give them more power and more flexibility. And Apex triggers are, of course, used with workflow rules to trigger activities that happen to your data behind the scenes. And finally, the data model portion of the programmatic approach is using the metadata API. Someone, for example, created a product called Workbench. So if you go to developerforce.com/workbench, I think it is, or search for Developerforce Workbench, that actually was created using the metadata API, and it gives you an extra window into what's happening in your org. If you're not familiar with Workbench, I encourage you to explore it at some point. The REST API and the bulk API allow you to do things like connect to other HTTP sites to receive data or send data to them. So if you connected two Salesforce orgs together, you might do that through the REST API, for example. And of course, the bulk API gives us things like data loader, which we all run on our desktops probably. Anybody here run data loader? That's an admin for you. Okay, admin. Woohoo! Thank you. Again, we were talking about the model view controller. It's a big part of what developers are concerned with. A lot of times in development, big development operations, they will have different individuals who specialize in individual parts of the model programming, the controller programming, the view programming. You guys can do it all because Salesforce helps you with that. You've seen that Salesforce helps you with that because you do it already as an admin. It also helps you with that with regards to the programmatic approach, because the view portion is handled by Visualforce, and you can see an example of Visualforce code up there. It uses those triangular brackets, which is very much like HTML. Anybody ever done any HTML in the room? See, you guys are all coders already. You probably see that the Visualforce code looks a lot like HTML. The brackets indicate a command that is executed that describes what the page should look like. And all of those open brackets end with the closed bracket and a slash. The slash doesn't have to be in the same line, but we'll look at that a little bit later. From the controller point of view, that would be Apex, and you see that the code is written differently on the next line. It uses curly brackets. It's more of a traditional programming language. Create methods and properties, and you use curly brackets to group portions of code that go together. Again, we'll look more closely at that later. And the model is all done for you with Salesforce. You've already built out your objects and your fields. You can use SOQL to actually access them from within your Apex code. And that's your model view controller, much of which you're already quite familiar with as an admin. Apex and Visualforce for every object and every field. Well, since these are tools that are built into Salesforce, you have complete access to your Salesforce data with Visualforce and Apex. It respects the security that you've already established, so that's a great advantage to it as well. And it's really easy to go from developing Salesforce from the admin perspective to developing from the programmer perspective. Anybody using Visualforce pages in their org currently? What sorts of things do you guys use Visualforce for? Somebody's using it. Okay, in the fourth row there. Somebody shout out something that you use Visualforce for. Where do you use Visualforce? Sorry? Custom pages. So you created a tab, maybe? Put it on the tab. Anybody using Visualforce someplace else besides a tab? So custom documents. So you're generating PDF with your Visualforce. That's another great example. Anybody else got any good examples of using Visualforce? Service Cloud. What are you using Visualforce for in the Service Cloud? Another thing you can do with Visualforce is actually display it on a record. So specific records can have Visualforce components displayed on them. Let's look at all the different ways we can use So embedded in page layouts, as I was saying, you can create email templates. We heard from someone who's already using it to generate PDFs. And we heard from someone who's doing page overrides. They have custom tabs. It also is incorporated into the mobile interface. So whatever you're doing with Salesforce 1, you can make it a little bit more custom with Visualforce. Here's an example of using Visualforce like you would use a tab. So you can create a tab on your org to send users directly to this Visualforce page. Or you can just send them there with a link using your org instance /apex/page name. So it's very easy to create Visualforce and then incorporate it into your org and into your users' daily activities. You can also use Visualforce to create mashups or do external sites. So mashups allow you to bring in pages from other websites, Google Map, for example, and you can display the information on your own website using Visualforce, as I mentioned before, using force.com sites, and basically an anonymous site user. You can create and deliver content right on your own website. Now let's talk a little bit about Apex, which is going to be our more Java-like programming language. And again, it's got a totally different point of view or consideration for use. It's the Salesforce platform language, and it's object-oriented. Now, I mentioned to you guys that I actually have a computer science degree, but I will admit to you now that I never really used it before recently. I got out of college and I wrote for computer magazines. And we all know what happened to computer magazines. They got eaten by the internet. And at that point, I decided to do other things and ended up becoming a Salesforce admin. So I sort of missed the whole object-oriented language thing, and I've had to dive in and learn polymorphism and things like that. So really am starting from scratch again in many ways. Apex is strongly typed. Another thing that you'll discover about programming is that it uses a lot of jargon that seems difficult but isn't. If you look up polymorphism on Wikipedia, it gives a very complex example of this is what polymorphism is. And then it says, so it's simply referred to as polymorphism. And I thought, I'm sorry, for me, polymorphism isn't simply anything. That is not a simple term for referring to something. And polymorphism is an inherent part of object-oriented code. It means that you can have a bit of code, a method, that behaves different ways depending on what data types are using that. So for example, if you are doing a plus sign in a formula, you know it does one thing if it's a number, and it does something different if it's a string, right? You guys are already doing that. You're already great programmers, well, great coders anyway. Apex, being a traditional platform language, it uses classes and interfaces, and it's cloud-based compiling and debugging and unit testing. And the good thing about that is that means that you can do all of your coding in Salesforce. They have external tools. There are external tools from third-party developers. There's also the force.com IDE, which you're welcome to play around with and use. But you might find that the tools that are already built into the force.com platform are more than enough for what you need, and you can do all your development right there in Salesforce. But you cannot do your development in a production org with Apex. You can do it with Visualforce. The difference being, Visualforce affects the user interface, and Apex does behind-the-scenes manipulation of your data. So they don't want you to accidentally destroy your data. So they don't let you do that. They make you do your development on Apex in Sandbox so that your production data is safe and sound. The other thing that means, I will tell you really quickly, we all know that Salesforce is a multi-tenant architecture. which means that we all live in the cloud together. We're all actually co-tenants in the same apartment building, if you will. And if somebody breaks a pipe in their penthouse apartment, their apartment is flooded, right? That means none of us get water because it's all going into that penthouse where he broke a pipe. We don't want that happening in our Salesforce orgs. If somebody breaks a pipe when they're creating their Apex code and they're getting a flood of data or creating a flood of data, Salesforce cuts that off. They control that in the sandbox so that they have governor limits, and when you exceed them, they say, you're taking up too many resources, nobody else is going to be able to enjoy the services that we provide. So that's what that is all about. When you hear about governor limits, they're just to protect you as a user of Salesforce. You don't want to be the guy in the penthouse with the broken pipe either, because his room is flooded. You don't want your data flooded. You don't need your org just churning out bad data constantly. So governor limits and the whole multi-tenant architecture go together, and they keep us safe from each other and safe from our own mistakes. And that's why we first do our coding in Sandbox. And that's what unit testing is about. So anybody have any ideas about what they would like to be able to do with Apex? Somebody mentioned that they wanted to do triggers. Anybody want to do triggers? Okay, there's a few people who still want to do triggers. Good. So triggers definitely are done in Apex, which means that you do them first in the sandbox. Visualforce controllers, I mentioned before to you that when you want your Visualforce page to basically be a simple page that's sort of reformatting the user experience for a single data object, that's very easy. You don't need a special Visualforce controller. But if you want a Visualforce page that incorporates multiple data objects, you need to be able to talk a little bit in a more complex way to the data model, to Salesforce. So then you use Apex in between your Visualforce and your Salesforce to say, hey, don't just fetch one record object type. Let's fetch a whole bunch of different ones. Let's fetch not just contacts, but contacts and accounts together so that we can do something, for example. That would all require a Visualforce controller that you would write in Apex in your sandbox. Custom web services and HTTP callouts. Again, that's the REST API. If you want to go and fetch data or send data to another Salesforce org or to any other cloud service, you can do that with the custom web services. Inbound and outbound email services. You guys have all seen on the App Exchange a lot of different email service provider applications. You could write your own with inbound and outbound email services. And there's also scheduled and batched tasks. With Data Loader on your desktop, the Data Loader that you download from within Salesforce, you can do some scheduled and batched tasks, but you can make those even more customized to your own needs if you use Apex. On an earlier slide, I mentioned that Apex is strongly typed, and that refers to the data types. You guys are already familiar with strongly typed data because you do that all the time in Salesforce as an admin. When you create a field, you tell Salesforce what kind of data is going to be stored in that field, and Salesforce enforces that for you. Apex is the same. We have to specify what kind of data type we're working with for any variable data. Let me take a step back and explain variables, just in case anybody's starting from scratch here. Variable, it's just like the word in the dictionary. Variable means it can change. The weather is variable. Every morning, you might get up and evaluate the variable weather. The variable weather today is reasonably warm, a little bit cool in the morning. We wore our jackets. When we go out at lunch, we'll evaluate the weather again, and we might decide to take our jackets off. So we're constantly working with variables. You know them, and you don't think about them. So don't worry about them when you're coding either. In that first line, it says string favorite performer equals Bruno Mars. String is the data type. Again, you guys know all this from creating fields in Salesforce. That's just like saying it's text. It's a text field, basically. But again, this is programming. It's not touching our Salesforce yet because we haven't asked it to. Favorite performer is the name of the variable. So that's the thing we're going to evaluate to see how it changes over time through our program. And it's written in what's called modified camel, which gives it a lowercase letter at the beginning and an uppercase letter for subsequent words. Makes it easy to read, and you know it's a variable because it starts with a lowercase letter. That's not required for programming, but it is recommended. You want to be able to go back and read your code, and you want to have code that other people can read, because remember, tip number 1, read more. If you're going to be reading other people's code, you want them to code in a way that you can read. So they're probably doing their variables like that as well, starting with a lowercase letter. Favorite performer equals Bruno Mars. You can see that it's in single quotes, and I will warn you right now, if you do Visualforce and you do Apex and you start with both at the same time, those quote marks are going to totally confuse you, because Visualforce uses a double quote mark and Apex uses a single quote mark. Apex is compiled. When you write it, you then basically try to save it, and when you try to save it, the Salesforce tries to compile it for you, and it will tell you if you have an error with your quote marks, so it's reasonably easy to fix. And at the end of every line, there's a semicolon. That lets the compiler know that that particular bit of code is finished. Our next data type is an integer, and again, it's the same sort of thing. You get the data type, the variable name, and then what it evaluates to. In this case, we're setting it equal to 12, and because it's a number, or an integer, I should say, rather than text, we don't need the quote marks anymore. That's true for decimal as well. It's actually also true for Boolean, as you see. You guys all know Booleans. You've all used checkboxes in fields when you create fields in Salesforce. That's Boolean. I kind of wish when we were in school and we had all those true-false tests, they should have just called them Boolean tests, and then we would all be smarter, but oh well. So Boolean is an easy concept, and then we've got dates. Dates and date time are different. Date lets you work with that value simply as the date and not with the time, obviously. They both have the ability to figure out what today is. And you can see the dot on the date. Tweet deadline equals date.today.adddays3. So let's try to parse that and figure out what it's doing. We're telling our compiler that we want a variable called tweet deadline. We want it to be of the data type date. So it's going to look like a date field in Salesforce. If you've done a formula and used today, then you're very familiar with saying today with the parens. That's all we're doing here. It's actually a method that can be associated with date. And add days is also a method that can be added. So we are evaluating today and adding 3 days to it. Basically, when we go to that Bruno Mars concert, we've got 3 days to tweet something about it. After that, it's old news, right? And the date time, I'm going to do a countdown started. I probably should have the D could be capitalized there probably. But anyway, date time, we're going to start that now, and that now is going to start 27 minutes into my session, to the countdown to our concert. And you can also create variables that represent Salesforce objects. The last example is that contact, the variable name is me, and the contact first name is Bonnie, last name Henners, and that's actually my email address, but it's one I don't check very often, so don't expect a reply back if you use that. Now, this is very different than the other examples that we've seen, that we're dealing with specific kinds of data and single values. In that last example, we're actually putting 3 different values in because contact has 3 fields. It has the first name field, the last name field, and the email field. But we're able to put all three of those values in when we create that new contact with the variable name me. Does anybody have any questions about what we've gone over so far? I think I've been kind of chugging through it kind of fast here. Don't be shy if you have a question or need me to go back. Yes? The new contact? Yes. If you're, well, because we're not actually dealing with the data model here, those could be anything. Because this is Apex, and Apex can talk to my data model, which is Salesforce, but it isn't automatically talking to my data model. In this case, all it's doing is it's creating a variable, a place to hold some data, and it's putting some data in that. It could be any fields. Since these are probably my, well, I would also need an account name, so they're not actually my required fields on contact. I would also need to know an account name before I could save this contact. So that's a really good point. And again, it's not talking to Salesforce, the data model, until you tell it to. So there's no sense of required versus not required fields at this particular stage. It's just data that Apex is messing around with. Okay, data collections. Well, we've kind of already seen that. In many ways, that contact variable is a data collection. It's a collection of the first name, the last name, and the email address. But you can have other kinds of collections as well. You can have a list of contacts. And that would mean, for example, in this first example, people I want to accompany to the Bruno Mars concert tonight. I can create a whole list of them, and I can pull them out of my Salesforce using that SOQL statement on the end. The SOQL statement is enclosed in square brackets that delineates it from other code in Apex. And I'm selecting the email and the ID from my Salesforce object. And it's from the contact object in this particular case. So again, I've got people to accompany is my variable name, and I'm using a list. So I could get, well, until I hit a governor limit, quite frankly, on the number of contacts that I return. Then when I want to deal, well, I'll show you later how I can deal with a specific person, but the first contact will be in my people to accompany list, and they're using array notation in that second line to specify the very first contact in that list. So the first line that you see in the first bullet point returns a whole, however many there are, of contacts that have an email and an ID in my Salesforce database. And the second line, using 0, because they're programmers, they like to start with 0, that tells me that I want that first contact in that list, the first one that got returned, and it assigns it to a contact variable. You can see the difference between how those data types are prepared. The first one is a list of contacts, and the second one is just a contact. The third one is also just a contact. It's the last contact in my list, and then the example uses a little bit of special code to figure out which one is going to be the last. We haven't counted them, but there's a size option. You see the dot? That's our polymorphism in action. Dot size lets us know that we're taking the people to accompany variable, we're computing the size of that variable, and then we're subtracting 1 to get the last number. The reason we're subtracting 1 is because we started with 0. That can be a little bit confusing. And I can tell you, when you write unit tests, always look for mistakes in that area. Always test for your minimum values and your maximum values, and use system asserts to make sure that you're getting the records that you think you're getting, because it's very easy to be off by 1. And now you can see why, because size is going to, if we've got 2 records and we start counting with 0, when we figure out the size, it's going to say, well, the size is 2. But if I put 2 in brackets, That's going to put me outside of my array length. My array starts with 0, and then it goes to number 1. My contact number 0 in my list, my contact number 1 in my list are my first and second contacts. I've only got 2, so size is going to tell me 2. And if I put the 2 in brackets, it says, gosh, I know 0 and I know 1, but I don't know contact 2 at this point. So that's why we have the -1. And that's why people end up with off by 1 errors when they code quite often, because they forget to take into account the fact that programmers like to start with 0 when they're counting. But when you're figuring out a value, obviously it's going to be the exact value. So I have exactly 2 contacts that I want to accompany to the concert, but the first one is actually contact 0. The second one is actually contact 1. I've got 2, I have to subtract 1 in order to get my last contact. Sets are like lists, but they are unordered and you can't have duplicates. We all know that there are cases where there's data that we might have duplicated in Salesforce. Maybe your contacts are unique to the contact owners, so you might actually want to have duplicate contacts in that case. You could use sets to deal with situations like that. And maps are key value pairs of data. Easy for you guys to understand what a map is, because if you've got a record ID and a record name, the record ID could be the key, and the record name could be the value that's being mapped with that key. So anytime you want to refer to or fetch information about the record name, you would just use that key to go and fetch it. And that's the way maps work. And we've already touched a little bit on dot notation. Again, this is sort of the thing that makes object-oriented programming object-oriented. It gives you the extensibility. We've got an example here of a decimal variable called company revenue, and it's my contact .account.revenue. So they're looking at the revenue on the account that's associated with that contact. Similarly, we've got a user data type. We have created a variable called related project owner, and we can access that data by pulling up the contact, finding the associated project. You can see the __C that tells you that is pulling a custom data object. You're probably all familiar with that from your Salesforce admin work. And we're getting the owner of that project that way. The third example, again, it's a list. This time it's a list of opportunities. And from that, we're setting the opportunity by looking at my contact, who we've already pulled up, and the account associated with that contact, and the opportunities, all of the opportunities associated with that account. We can also use dot notation to call instance methods. So we've already talked about that as well. The size, for example, the dot today. Those are methods that help you operate on a specific bit of data. They've even got an example of I love caps. So they're going to capitalize the first name just by putting dot capitalize with parens on the end. Loops. Now, sometimes people find that loops confuse them. And I'm going to tell you, don't be worried about loops, because you speak a human language. You already understand what it means to say, for every one of these chairs, I want one person to sit in them. In that case, we would pull up one person from the audience, sit them in the first chair, the next person, sit them in the next chair, until all the chairs were filled. That's all a for loop is. So for each chair, put a person in it. It's easy to understand. One thing to note is if you've got multiple commands that you're trying to operate within your for loop, you use the curly brackets again. We talked about the fact that whenever you're grouping code together that's related, you use the curly brackets at the beginning and at the end. So we'll look at what these examples do, what this example does. First of all, it creates a list of contacts. It puts that list into the variable called all contacts. It goes out to Salesforce to find the values to set up or initialize for all contacts. And in this case, it's giving us everything. It's selecting ID from contact. There's no conditional statement where my contact equals Bonnie. It's just every contact, so that's a big old list. And then in the for statement, the parentheses, you guys know parentheses from doing formulas, so that's nothing new for you. The for statement is actually a special notation with the colon in between. It tells you that you're going to create another variable, and it's a contact variable. It's going to be called current contact, and with that colon, all contacts, it's special notation for Apex, that lets you step through that list of contacts that we created. So we have that huge long list of all of our contacts. We want to look at one contact at a time for every contact in that list. And that's the notation to do that. You put the list variable on the end, you put a colon in between, and you put the individual that you're going to be working with one at a time prior to that. And of course, you have to define that variable in your for loop or prior to your for loop. The next line you see is actually a comment. It's got the 2 slashes preceding it, which tell the compiler not to try to do anything with that code. And the line after that is what we're actually doing with the current contact. So for this loop, what we're saying is for every contact in my list, set the best friend equal to a record ID. Does anybody see anything that's not a best practice in that code right now? It's a trick question. Yes, thank you in the back. I'm not sure who it is because I can't see that far. Hard coding the ID. And why is that a bad idea? You're there you go. All of those reasons. So you're very limited. So you're saying that only M1R can ever be a best friend to anyone, and that's not what how people want to live their lives. Gosh. And you're also saying that M1R can never be deleted because that person has to be a best friend to everybody else, always. It's not a good way to code. And when you're working in your sandbox, you know that your IDs don't necessarily behave the same. You're not going to have the same IDs on records in your sandbox necessarily to those in your production org. So don't use that as an example. Better would be current contact.bestFriend equals Bonnie. Yes? That's a good question. Do we need to select the best friend because it's not in the list? That is one of those things that I would actually find out when I tried to compile it and got an error, quite frankly. I frequently forget. So he's saying that with our SOQL statement, we're selecting the ID from the contact. We're not actually selecting the best friend field. So how are we putting a value into best friend if we haven't pulled that field from all contacts or as part of all contacts? And really from a best practice standpoint, you should. If you're going to be operating on a field, you should have it in there. But again, if it's something that you leave out when you try to compile it, it will tell you that the compiler doesn't know anything about best friend as a field on contact because you haven't pulled it down. So thank you very much for pointing that out. The other thing is, of course, we're not reaching out again to Salesforce at any point here, which means that we've set the best friend, but we've never written it to Salesforce. We've set it in a variable, and variables change. We've never saved that information. If we wanted to save it, we would do that with an insert contact. We could insert all of our contacts again, so we're doing the for loop to step through all of our contacts. And the best place to do that insert is actually outside of the curly brackets and outside of the for loop. You don't want to insert every single time you've touched a contact. You want to actually do the insert with the whole group all at once. So update all of the records through the variables in the program, and then take all of that whole list and upload it into Salesforce using an insert. And that would be after the curly brackets. That's called bulkifying your code. You guys are super advanced because we've already got to bulkifying your code. You could run into DML governor limits if you're trying to insert every single record one at a time. Salesforce says, what are you doing that for? I think it's 200 for inserts, but if you're doing it outside of that for loop, Salesforce will break up your list and do 200 at a time, basically. Yeah. These are our comparison operators. You guys may already be really super familiar with these from formulas. I just want to point out that the last example is presenter.sleephours__c is equal to 5. I'm not sure I got that many hours last night. There are 2 equal signs there. If I were setting the variable presenter sleep hours, I would use 1. When I was learning to code, the way that I kept those 2 separate in my brain, my tiny little brain, is that if I saw 2, I pronounced it to myself as is equal. And if I saw 1, I pronounced it to myself as equals. So if it said presenter.sleephours equals 5 with just 1 equal sign, then I'm setting the value. If it says presenter.sleephours equal, that's presenter.sleephours is equal to 5. So that's my way, my own personal way of keeping those 2 separate so that I avoid mistakes. You can see that we also have an example, the first example, presenter.age__c less than or equal to Mark Benioff's age. Anybody think they know the answer to that? And you'd better say yes. True, true. Presenter.num session attended. Anybody know what that one's going to be? What do you think? Is that true or false, the second comparison there? False? You guys think false? So you think I've attended more than 10 sessions? I guess it depends on if we're talking about this Dreamforce or all Dreamforces through history. And I have gotten myself caught. There we go. Sorry. Last one, presenter, the third one on the list. Anybody think they know how that one would evaluate? False, thank you. Yes, so that is presenter.gender__c, not equal to male. And you guys said false, so you think I'm up here in drag. Actually, it's true, I'm not male. The exclamation point makes that a not for the equal sign. So I'm not sure what you guys are looking at, but gonna have to up the game on femininity, apparently. Yes. Sorry, I have a question up here. I'll get to yours in just a second. So you're asking the presenter. So in this case, presenter is a variable, probably, and it's probably the variable on an object in Salesforce. The reason I think it's a variable on an object in Salesforce is because the __c indicates to me that we're pulling fields out of Salesforce, that we're referring to fields that we know of in Salesforce. So presenter could be a variable associated with a contact in my Salesforce database. Perhaps I used that all contacts, pulled down a whole list, and assigned one particular contact to be a presenter. And then I wanted to figure out what the age of my presenter was and what the number of sessions and so forth. The white ones would be the fields, and the yellow one would be the variable presenter that we've already set up somewhere else in our code. So we'll go back one more page. In this case, if it said contact presenter, all contacts, then it would step through every contact and evaluate their suitability perhaps as a presenter, which of course would have nothing to do with any of these fields. I'm sorry? It's like a table in many ways. And there was a question further back?
Yeah, I just wanted to know what the 2 equals are.
2 equals means is equal to. So that's a comparison operator. As I was saying, if it's a single equal sign, then we're setting the value. And for me personally, when I read those, I read presenter sleep hours is equal, because I have 2 equal signs, I put 2 words in, is equal. And if there's only 1 equal sign, I only put 1 word in, and so then it would say sleep hours equal 5, and that would be setting the value. Yes?
I also didn't catch what the exclamation mark followed by equals.
Exclamation, so every time there's something in our program, it's going to be a value, it's going to be dealt with by the compiler. And in this case, we've got something before the equals, it's an exclamation point, and it means not. Anytime, yes, you could say not less than, in fact, or not greater than. So you could also use that exclamation point 1 line up or 2 lines up to make those not less than or equal to or not less than.
Should there be a semicolon after 10?
Excellent catch. There should be a semicolon after 10. You guys are great at coding. And just another real quick, I just want to point out the similarity to poetry, since I brought up Shakespeare and haikus. There are rules about how you begin lines, how you end lines, how the lines are shaped all between. Think of all the rules about writing sonnets that Shakespeare had to put up with. This seems easy by comparison. Yes, that's okay. Well, at some point, we have to be able to evaluate whether or not sleep hours is equal to 5. We have to have, at some point, given sleep hours a value. So I think we have a previous screen. Here we have best friend equals this record ID. That's where we're setting the value. It could be that, I wish this example were, listing all of our contacts, and then for every contact, set them equal to presenter, and then on the next line, set the presenter's sleep hours, because we want them to have a minimum of 8 hours sleep so they do a great job when they're presenting to you all. In which case, we would then evaluate, are those sleep hours equal to 5, or are they greater than 5? Excellent. Other questions? Okay, now we're on the if statement. Oh, before I go to if, I did also want to point out that you can nest the for loops. So within this, I'll try not to confuse you too much, but this is another source of potential errors and why your program isn't behaving the way you want it to, so I want to bring this to your attention. You can nest for loops. If I had a giant bag of M&Ms up here, I might say, for everyone in the audience, give them 1 M&M. I would really need a nested for loop to get a program to do that. I would have to say, for everyone in the audience, for every M&M, give them 1. But I'd have to be really careful, because in one case, the computer is going to take that bag of M&Ms to the first person in the audience, and for every M&M in that bag, just keep handing that person 1. Really what I want to say is, for every M&M in the bag, for someone in the audience, give them 1 M&M. So I want to evaluate the M&Ms first, get 1 M&M, then evaluate the people, get 1 person, put those 2 together, and then go back to the people, find I don't have an M&M anymore, and go back to my M&M loop. So it's a little bit confusing, but I wanted to point out you can do nested for loops, and it is a source of confusion. You just have to be careful about the order that you do them in. statements can also be nested, and they can also basically just be translated to English. If you've ever said, if this happens, then I want everyone to, if the fire alarm goes off, then I want everyone to proceed very quietly and carefully to the exits. Or else, if the fire alarm doesn't go off, I'd like you all to stay and listen to me yammer on a bit more. You guys are already really pros at understanding if-else statements. For Apex, they drop the then. Then's not part of it. But in some ways, when I'm coding, I like to think of my curly brackets as then. Curly brackets aren't absolutely necessary with an if statement. If I only have one line of code, I can put it all together with my if statement. If the fire alarm goes off, exit, semicolon. That would be one statement that would tell my program that if the fire alarm goes off, exit, that's all you do, we're done. If there's more instructions, I use the curly brackets. And as I said, I sometimes think to myself when I see that curly bracket as then. So if, whatever the comparison is there, if the fire alarm goes off, then my curly bracket represents then to me. I have some instructions for you all. The next line there, this is actually one big block of code. You can tell it's one big block of code by counting the parens. And the next else statement actually does another comparison. So if the fire alarm goes off, there's specific behaviors I want to happen. Or else, if everyone's enjoying the session, then they should just stay and learn more about using Apex. The last else is what happens if none of those are true. So if it's not true that the fire alarm went off, and it's not true that you're getting a lot out of this session, then there's other code that is different than proceeding through the fire alarm drill or just sitting and enjoying the session. I think I've made that more confusing than it needs to be. Does anybody have any questions about the if, then, else statements?
Yeah.
Yes?
How is that more powerful than
How is it more powerful than
an if statement in a formula field?
an if statement in a formula field? It's pretty much the same as an if statement in a formula field. I think that the main difference is the curly brackets and the fact that when you're writing in Apex, you're probably going to use the curly brackets in combination with some indentation that make it more readable. And you know, when you're doing formula fields, they tend to all run together, and if they get long, you get a little bit lost sometimes. Yes? There's better than cheat sheets. It's developer.force.com, I believe, or it could be developerforce.com. You guys all had it from the sign up for your new org. There are infinitely many, well, not infinite, that's mathematically incorrect. There are lots and lots of resources available on that site, including cheat sheets. So there's a Visualforce cheat sheet and an Apex cheat sheet that will help you to remember specific syntaxes and how operations work. There are also the guidebooks that will help to teach you. They are, I think the Visualforce one is over 700 pages long now. I encourage you, as I said, read every day. Put that on your Kindle, on your iPad, on your e-book device, and just open it up and look at it every day and learn something new. It's really worthwhile. Yes? Do we need a semicolon where? Okay, so for this if statement, we actually don't have any real code happening. We only have comments. You can tell it's a comment because of the double slash. So there's no need for a semicolon because our compiler goes through and it says, oh, there's some code, it's an if statement, and then there's a comment, so I'm ignoring it. So if we had an actual line of code in there instead of the comment, that would be where the semicolon was. And if we didn't have the curly braces, if we just had that one command, if fire alarm goes off, exit, then we would have a semicolon because we're not nesting or grouping a bunch of commands together. Does that make sense? Does that answer? Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Now, we've got creating, updating, and deleting records. Again, Apex does its own thing and doesn't even think about the fact that there's a data model unless you give it the right syntax to think about the data model. And in this case, we're actually doing those DML, data manipulation language commands, insert, update, delete. It's the same thing that you already know from giving users permission on objects. And it's important to know that Apex generally will follow permissions. So if a specific user has initiated a specific action, if they can't actually create a lead, then this would not work for them unless you tell Apex to ignore all of the sharing rules that you so carefully crafted in your org. Probably you're not going to do that. But for triggers, for example, those more than likely you don't want them to follow any sort of sharing rules. And that would be anonymous Apex then. So we've got insert, update, and delete, and our example code shows creating a lead. We've got our data types, and this is pretty nicely written code because you can follow the columns basically. In that first section, you can see we've got the lead data type followed by a variable named myLead, and we're just creating a new lead. So the assignment for that value for that variable is just blank. It's just new lead. The next line sets the first name for that lead. Now, being that it's Apex and tightly bound to Salesforce, that means that it actually knows things about your variables based on your Salesforce data model. You've said lead, so Apex said, I know what a lead is because I'm related to Salesforce and I know all about leads. Leads have first names, they have last names, they have company names. So in your Apex code, you can simply put mylead.firstname, mylead.lastname, and mylead.company, and you can set values for those. They're still variables. They're still outside of your Salesforce database until that last command, insert mylead. And that's where Apex says, okay, not only do I have to know about Salesforce, I have to communicate with Salesforce. So now I'm going to communicate all of this data into the Salesforce database. The next example is mylead.status_C is broke. Poor David. He's unemployed at the moment, I guess. Actually, David Liu, in case you don't know, kind of initiated this class with the Apex for Admins and the blog that he does, and he currently works for Google, so I don't think he's broke. mylead.budget__C equals 0. We can take those two values and just update the lead. The lead got inserted into the database. That means a new lead was created, and the update is just for that specific lead. Yes? Absolutely, absolutely. You can see it's working with the custom fields, and if you wanted it to be a custom object, then you would use the custom object name in place of lead. And of course, you'd have the __C. Because you're running Apex in your instance and related to your instance, it knows all about your metadata, your instance, your custom objects and fields. Yes? Do you have to create the class for your custom objects? You don't have to create the class for your custom objects, no, because it knows what your org looks like, basically, when you're programming for your org. Right. If you were, one pattern for development, as we've said, you can't develop Apex in your production org because of the governor limits. I'll get to you in just a second, sorry. We can't develop our code in our production org. We have to start in the sandbox so that we don't break our own data or totally trash everybody's instances of their production orgs or slow them down in their performance. Another way is to start in a developer org. You guys have signed up for a free developer org. You can have infinitely many developer orgs. I personally like to start coding in a developer org because it's clean. It doesn't have the baggage of the third-party applications. And so it's very easy to not accidentally try to name something that's already been named by somebody else. I don't have to worry about what sorts of classes are doing other things. I don't have to worry about coordinating with other people's unit tests that they have for their applications, which I will eventually worry about. But when I'm first starting my code, I like to just do it in a developer org and then move that to Sandbox. So in that case, I would need to make sure that my developer org had the same custom objects in it that I needed to address in my code, obviously. Now, oh, you had a question before we move on. Sorry.
So on a previous slide, you had created contact in a similar fashion to that first slide. No? Well, can you go back to the one with the lead?
Yes.
Okay. So you had contact like my contact equals new contact, and then in parentheses, you assign values to several variables.
Right.
Or several field names on that.
Right.
So is that an alternative to using this sequence where you go my lead dot first name, my lead dot last name, my name?
That's an excellent point, actually. Thank you for bringing that up. So here we've got lead, which is the data type, my lead, which is the variable, and we're setting it equal to lead. The parentheses are empty, so we're creating a new and empty lead. It's a variable. It's not a record in Salesforce, so it can be empty. If we wanted to put all of that data, as you mentioned, the first name, last name, and company name, into that lead when we first create it, instead of doing it in separate lines afterwards, we would take that and put it into the parens. And we did see that example using contacts on a way previous slide, where it said contact, new contact equals, and then it was new contact, paren, first name equal David, last name equal Liu, company equal unemployed, close paren. And that works the same.
And then in the very next, so without having those 3 lines in the middle, you could just insert it.
Yes, and then you could just do an insert because you've created the new contact or new lead. You've put values in those parens. Those parens represent the space where you can pass parameters. So now we're getting into the whole methods and properties sorts of conversation. Lead is actually, in this case, I guess, a property that we can pass values to, and it's going to behave a certain way based on what values we pass to it. Methods the same. If you ever pass a record ID to, or do an action, perhaps a publisher action from a record ID, or execute a Visualforce page from a record ID, you know it's pulling that record ID and it's doing something specific on that record. Code-wise, you would make sure that you put that data in the parens so that it says, okay, we're acting on this specific data when we do this. We're not just starting from scratch. Yes? Okay, so the question is, if we don't want to hard code information, why are we hard coding David Liu, who's unemployed? And that's a good question, too. In this case, yeah, I have really no really great example of why we would use David's name instead of pulling it from someplace else. Typically, you would have a variable. Perhaps you've got a form, a Visualforce form on your website where you're pulling in first name, last name, and company name from individuals because you're working with, well, company name you could actually do this way through insert lead as long as it's created, but maybe you need to create an account as well as a contact because it's a brand new person for your org. You've got this blank form, Visualforce, on your website. You're going to need an Apex controller to create the account and the contact. So your Apex controller would take that name, David, that David enters when he fills out your form, and it would put it actually into a variable name. So you're absolutely right. That's a really good catch. And instead, it would say my lead dot first name equals form submission first name. Pardon me. And for last name, it would say, instead of Liu, that Liu would be passed into a variable elsewhere in your Apex code, and you would set the last name equal to that variable, form submission last name. That would just be the variable name that I picked because it was descriptive, and if I looked at my code, I could say, oh, form submission means that it's coming off that Visualforce form that this Apex controller works with. You can name your variables however you want to name them. In that case, Visualforce and Apex would be working together. Apex would be a controller on my Visualforce page, and they would be able to swap data back and forth. So I might use Apex params on my Visualforce page to call variables that are in my Apex code. Or I might just look at the way I've set up the form on Visualforce to give that insert line, or blanking on what the field would be called. Basically, input field line would have an ID associated with it, and I could refer to each specific input that's on my Visualforce form by the ID of that input line on my Visualforce form. I wouldn't say that one, they call each other. They talk back and forth. There's not, the Visualforce is the layout, as you say, it's the view portion. The Apex is the controller portion. They communicate to each other through variables, basically. The form would be inside Visualforce because we're delivering it up on our website for our anonymous users to fill in some information. Yes? Now, Apex in the context of Visualforce, we've touched on this a little bit already. Apex is going to give us a little extra power with our Visualforce. Again, Visualforce is just a framework to build custom user interfaces. It's the view portion. It's hosted natively on force.com. People are doing some pretty exciting and intricate layouts and customizations using it. You can use it to extend functionality to give your users a better user experience. And you can customize pages for specific devices. The controllers provide access to the data. Again, yes? Yes. Oops. Yes. So the bottom example, well, both of these examples are actually probably not being delivered on public sites, although the top example could be a community site page, so it could in fact be public. The bottom site looks like it's not going to be public because it looks too built into Salesforce, so it would probably require a login. But if you go to develop sites, there's an option for creating force.com site pages using Visualforce, and you can create a guest user. That would be the way that Salesforce identifies all of those people that use your force.com site page. So the lead form that I fantasized about on the previous slide, all of those leads that got inserted with the name David Liu, which we hard-coded wrongly into our statement, they would all be owned by site guest user. And I could name that user something other than site guest user, but the default name is site guest user. I'm sorry? Yes. So it's an anonymous account at that point. It's on a public web page. It's basically your website's account in some ways. And so that web page would have its own If you have multiple Force.com site pages that you're feeding up through your website for anonymous users, they could each have their own separate. So each web page has its own ID to Salesforce from the Salesforce perspective. So you'd have site guest user A and site guest user B coming from two different Force.com site pages that you've created using Visualforce. Now, as we were discussing before, Visualforce controllers provide access to data. Actually, if you're using a Visualforce page to perform some basic, maybe just change the user interface for your Salesforce.com users when they're accessing data. You want to lay that data out in a different way or give them a different view or beautify it in some way. In that case, you don't need a controller because you're dealing with one Salesforce object and the associated records for that one object. But as soon as you start trying to do something more complex, like working with two objects or more, then you need a Visualforce controller to say, okay, you know how to deal with one object, but let's talk about how to deal with two, and I'll set you straight on that. The controller is going to control things from that perspective. So the standard controllers are the ones that give you the same functionality as standard pages in Salesforce. The save, the delete, the access to field data, et cetera. And the custom controllers are what you write in Apex to do something beyond what the standard behaviors would be. If you need save to do something other than what the regular save button in Salesforce does, on your Visualforce page, you want save to do something else, you can rewrite save using an Apex controller. So instead of just saving, maybe you're going to check for a duplicate before you actually save the data and get the user to confirm yes or no. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. If all you're doing is serving up a page for your users where they can view accounts in a certain way, maybe you want them to get a list of accounts that are related to them that meet a certain criteria, you can, right, you can use a list view. But in some cases, you want to do some formatting. Again, Visualforce is a lot like HTML, so you can use CSS to customize that view. If you need to do that, then it would be through the standard controllers. Another great use for Visualforce is with Flow. When you want to make Flow a little prettier for your users or a little more complex in the way it behaves, you can use a standard controller and not. Flow is, that's a good question. Salesforce Flow is in many ways like a visual programming. It lets you do things, create forms, or create formulas that enforce data consistency, all using elements that you drag and drop as opposed to writing out code in text. So I would encourage you to actually research that. I don't have time to go into that a great deal, but Flow, I'm actually doing a session later today at 5 over in the admin zone if you want to come and get a look at using code and Flow together. And on Thursday morning at 9 a.m. in the Century Theaters with Keith Sadler from Apereo, I'm going to do another intro to Flow. It's sort of an in-between step, actually, between being an admin and being a developer. It's clicks, not code, coding in some ways. And it can be incorporated into your Visualforce and Apex programming efforts as well. So controller extensions let you actually build upon controllers that you've already got. We were talking about how if you've got a Visualforce page and you want it to do something more complicated than what the standard Salesforce page would do for that same type of record, for example, overriding save and delete, you can have a controller that defines those new behaviors for save and delete. If you decide at some later date that there's yet another behavior that you want to add, you can either rewrite the original controller or preferably write a controller extension, because that way your code is a little bit smaller and easier to manage, and you can pull out parts that aren't working and let users continue to use the parts that are working without much concern. And with 3 releases of Salesforce every year, it's really important to make sure that all your parts and pieces continue to work with all those new releases. If you're not trying to make sure you've got a sandbox that's running pre-release, once you start coding, you will need to do that, because you'll want to be running your unit tests and running all of your code in that pre-release sandbox, so that if something's broken, you can let Salesforce know, and they do go to great effort to make sure that people's code stays operational. They don't want, that's the whole purpose of the sandbox preview, as far as I know, and that is to make sure that people who write code can check their code, and Salesforce can fix anything that seems inconsistent from one release to another. With thousands of developers, clearly that's something important that they need our help with and can't just do themselves. But once you write a unit test, actually they do run all those unit tests in Salesforce. Salesforce itself says, oh, I know where the unit tests are, I'm running them. Okay, how do we connect Visualforce to a controller? In this case, someone in the front had asked previously whether my Visualforce or Apex needed to in any way define what my custom object looked like. In this case, I'm using the standard object for a custom object, a standard controller for a custom object. And I name it just with the _C. I've also tacked on 2 controller extensions, extension 1 and extension 2. And again, like HTML, it uses the triangular brackets, the beginning and the close. And for the close bracket, there's always a slash. If I wanted to actually have multiple lines here, I could. Sometimes you have a whole block of Apex. So for example, an Apex form would start with bracket Apex : form, and then it would have a closed bracket without a slash, because then I would define my form. In some ways, that's like the curly brackets. You would use Apex form, it would have the open and closed brackets, and then there would be an Apex form again at the end of the whole definition of the form, but the last one would have open bracket slash Apex form closed bracket to let the compiler know at what point that form definition has ended. So this is an example of using Apex and Visualforce together, but actually before I get too far into this, I'm going to try to give you an example of 2 pages that behave differently depending on which controller they use. So this is my, nope, this is not my, let me try that again. This is my restaurant page using the standard controller for my restaurant custom object. The custom object was defined in Salesforce, the way we do our Salesforce admin job of defining objects. And for the Visualforce page, I'm just using that standard controller equals restaurant __C to let Visualforce know that that's the particular object that we're working with. And it displays my page like so. And if I wanted to do some more custom styling and make it look a little bit less like traditional Salesforce, I could actually use a custom controller and do some slightly fancier work with that particular data. So it does give you a lot of flexibility. Okay, back to our show. Here we've got an example of using a controller that's a custom controller called reservation search. Hope you guys can see that in the back. Instead of saying standard controller equal and something in double quotes, because it's Visualforce, double quotes, we've instead got it saying a controller equals reservation search. And tab style is reservation _ C, just to give it a little styling that's already built in. So that's our example of specifying the custom controller to change our way of interacting. And I already showed you those. So, pop quiz. If you're going to query lists of data programmatically and you don't use a standard controller, what are you going to do? That's a trick question because I don't think we've really gotten there yet. We touched on it just a little bit, and that's the Salesforce object query language. That means that you're going to now require, instead of using the standard controller to get that list of data, you're going to require a custom controller in Apex. Apex can use SOQL, and Visualforce only uses SOQL through its interaction with an Apex controller. So what is SOQL? Anybody remember what those letters stand for? Everybody knows. Excellent. Thank you, guys. Salesforce Object Query Language, and there it says that right there. It's similar to SOQL, which, of course, is some other product. And it's streamlined to traverse our relationships within the Salesforce database model. It's part of Apex. It is not part of Visualforce. But through the controller on Visualforce, you can use SOQL in Apex for your Visualforce pages. And you can return nested objects. So you get information about parent objects when you bring down, for example, a contact, you will get some information about the account. You can't reference fields on queried instance variables without querying for them. So we had a question earlier about whether or not we could use that best friend field when we hadn't actually queried our all contacts for that best friend. And as pointed out, we would really need to specify. Here's an example, again, of a SOQL statement. We're selecting ID, name, phone from contact. That's pretty straightforward. We can add to that a conditional statement. So now we're not going to get every single contact in our database, which would probably blow out some governor limits on us. We're going to say instead we want only those contacts where the phone number is not equal to null. A more practical search might actually be looking for the ones that are null so that we can get them corrected, but that's okay. And perhaps we want to make it a little bit more complex still and say we really only want the contacts whose name is something like Rose and for whom we have a phone number already. Yes? Is it case sensitive or not? I'm pretty sure that SOQL is not case sensitive. So Rose would return whether it was capital R Rosefield or lowercase r Primrose. Both values would be returned. And in this case, we're going to order by name. So Rosefield and Primrose are going to be alphabetized for us. So our SOQL statement can actually do a lot for us and is quite powerful on its own. As we saw before, the results of the SOQL statement in Apex are stored in list objects, and list objects are ordered. So that object bracket 0 is always going to be the same first element until you reorder or resort them. Yes? Why is it when you look up objects, they're not ordered by name? Where are you doing the lookup?
Where you want to, like if you're going to insert a field, you're cycling down to insert for which object.
I believe that for most searches and SOQL alike, that it is going to do one of two different orderings by default, and one ordering would be by create date and time. That's basically going to be a record ID ordering. And the other ordering would be most recently viewed, basically. So I think the confusion comes from the fact that the default ordering isn't name. It's something else, and it's something else depending on the context in which the search is performed. Any other questions? Okay, so you can force that to give it the list in the order that you want instead of the Salesforce default ordering by specifying the field for ordering. And you can also specify a limit. So perhaps everybody in our database has rows in their name, and we really only can look at 50 at a time reasonably. So that's what we're going to return. In this case, we're also trying to get a little extra information from our contact. We've decided that we want to return parent information as well. We all know that contacts are child records off of the account. So when we want to refer to the parent record, if we want the name rather than the ID, we would actually need to put that field into our selection as well. Here. I'm sorry? No joins. They're known because Apex knows your data model. In this one, let's see, selecting name, but we've got a nested SOQL statement. We're selecting the name from the account, but before we do that, we're figuring out exactly, well, we're also selecting first name, last name, phone from contacts. We could have a where clause in there that limits so that we're saying select first name, last name, phone from contacts where contact phone number is not equal to null. In this case, we're just saying not only on our account do we want our name field, but we also want these three fields from our contacts, all contacts that are related to this account. You can execute SOQL statements in the developer console. It's a great way to try out the statement and make sure it works and returns the results that you're expecting before you put that into your Apex code. It's a really good practice to go into that developer console, which you have access to right from Salesforce. You just, I believe it's go into your name and pull down the menu, and developer console should be there. If it's not there, you may not have it checked off as an option for you on your user record. So just go into your user record and double check. Yes? We haven't been writing things all along. We've just been showing them basically. So this is where you could write them in the developer console. I guess there was Visual Page Editor that we also saw, right? So
It's more so this is where you would execute it versus you can write it anywhere, but you're going to paste it in here and execute on it versus the result of that. Or to update records or insert records. This is writing. Yeah, you can do both here. You can already.
you can do, yes, you can do everything in the developer console. And it totally depends on what your needs are as a developer. If you need 3 different blocks to view what's happening, the history of all your SOQL searches, the results of your search, and the current search, as opposed to I'm doing something quick and easy in Visualforce and Apex, and I've actually used this SOQL search a million times before, it's not that hard. I'm probably just going to do that in my Apex editor and my Visualforce editor to make it happen quicker. I may not want to have my screen divided into 3 parts because I'm doing something very familiar to me and I don't need quite that much feedback sometimes.
Where would your Apex editor be?
If you go to develop Apex classes, or if you go to the trigger editors, then you can just dive right into the Apex code editor.
UI rather than being in the developer console?
It's a bit like a text editor. I mean, it is just a text editor. You get to define or read about the definition of your class or page, and you get a text editor box in which to put your code. Yes, it's all in Salesforce. That's under setup, develop, classes, triggers, pages.
So you can create Apex triggers there, or you can create them here in the developer console using Visualforce.
You can create Apex triggers in the developer console. You can create them in the Apex editor. You can create them in the Force.com IDE. You can use third-party apps to create them. You could probably, if you were really braver than me, develop one in Notepad and use Workbench or something like that to put it up, deploy it into your org. I don't recommend that last method, but plenty of ways. For compiling, you probably want to go through the developer console or the editor, which tries to compile before saving, or the IDE. Sorry? Uh-huh. The SOQL statement, well, let's go back, sorry. The SOQL statement, if all you're doing is testing a SOQL statement, you're going to need to do that in the developer console. That's not a complete Apex code, it's a snippet. So the developer console gives you the freedom to execute snippets and see how they behave, which is good if you're writing complex code. It means that you can pull out just a small section, see how it behaves, like your search, your query, and it's a better way of checking the performance of your code. You can do the whole thing in the console as well, but you can't do snippets in the Apex editor. You have to do a complete class definition. So let's assume that we like the behavior of this SOQL statement. We see the results for it. We've now taken it and pasted it into our Apex controller code. Our Apex controller code is tied to our Visualforce page. So we can preview the Visualforce page from the Visualforce page editor by clicking the preview button. We can access it directly by link by using our instance name /apex/page name. And that Visualforce page will execute whatever code is necessary to function from Apex. Because they're married, basically, it will say, hey, come with me, we are doing this now. and Apex will control that data for that Visualforce page. So those are great ways. You can also execute from the developer console when you're testing. In the case of the Apex controller, you would probably want to execute the Visualforce page using the preview option on the developer console. And that way it would execute your Apex controller and you could get feedback and debug messages, etc. Now, I'm not sure whether we covered this or not, but you guys are all super duper admins, so you might already know this. Anybody know where we would upload an image to use in a Visualforce page? Static resources, excellent. You guys probably also saw that when I clicked the wrong way on my slides. Okay, we are going to start with the workbook exercises now, and I think I have some helpers in the back of the room. I hope so. I didn't meet them when they came in earlier. If not, I will be dashing around trying to help anyone who might have any questions. We've got a URL here for our first exercise, which is Visualforce homepage component, and I believe about 20 minutes should be enough, give or take, to do that. And I'll check with you all close to 20 minutes to see if you're close to being done.